Picture this: you're 46 years old, standing at the pinnacle of your intellectual career, and suddenly your brain, the very organ that defines your existence, becomes your enemy. This isn't fiction. This is the reality that confronted Neil, a philosophy professor, whose life story challenges everything we think we know about choice, identity, and what makes life worth living. The irony was almost cruel in its precision. Here was a man who had spent decades teaching a course called Pessimism, Despair and Hope, only to find himself living the ultimate embodiment of that philosophical tension. One moment, he was discussing the darkest corners of human existence with his students at New York University. The next moment, his head was tilting unnaturally, his eyes rolling back, his body collapsing as his brain rebelled against him. What the medical team discovered would have been devastating news for anyone, but for Neil, it was particularly existential. An arteriovenous malformation lurked in his brain like a ticking time bomb. This wasn't just a medical condition, it was a philosophical crisis wrapped in biological reality. Doctors explained the situation with clinical precision. They could fix it, yes, but the cure might destroy the very essence of who Neil was. The malformation sat nestled in his frontal lobe, that magnificent region responsible for abstract thinking, complex reasoning, and the kind of deep philosophical contemplation that had defined his entire adult life. Remove it, and you might save his body while killing his mind. Leave it, and his mind might remain intact until his body gave out entirely. To understand the weight of this choice, we need to travel back to Neil's childhood, where the seeds of his philosophical obsession were first planted. At just 8 years old, he watched his older brother succumb to acute myeloid leukemia, a brutal introduction to the arbitrary cruelty of existence that would shape his worldview forever. Death, he learned early, doesn't negotiate or explain itself. The family unit, that should have provided comfort during this tragedy, instead crumbled. His parents' marriage, apparently held together by the fragile hope of their sick child's recovery, dissolved once that hope was extinguished. Neil found himself not just brotherless, but essentially parentless in any meaningful emotional sense. His father, a hotel consultant whose work demanded constant travel, swept Neil along on his nomadic journey. They moved from city to city, hotel to hotel, culture to culture. While other children were building lasting friendships and stable identities, Neil was learning that everything, relationships, homes, even families, was temporary and fragile. This rootless existence might have broken another child, but for Neil, it became a philosophical laboratory. Each new place revealed different ways humans organized their societies, different approaches to meaning-making, different responses to suffering. He began to see patterns in human misery that transcended geography and culture. The great philosophical pessimists became his companions. Dostoevsky's tortured characters, Schopenhauer's systematic dismantling of optimism, the existential bleakness of thinkers who refused to sugarcoat reality. These weren't just academic interests for Neil, they were survival tools, ways of making sense of a world that had shown him its cruelest face before he'd even learned to ride a bicycle. But here's what made Neil extraordinary. He wasn't drawn to pessimism because he enjoyed darkness. He was drawn to it because he demanded truth. "I don't want to be pessimistic," he would later explain. "I want to be honest." And honesty, he discovered, often wears the face of pessimism. This commitment to unflinching truth became the foundation of his academic career. His 6 published books didn't just explore philosophical concepts, they excavated them from the depths of genuine human experience. His writing possessed that rare quality of being simultaneously devastating and beautiful, capable of destroying comfortable illusions while offering something more valuable: clarity. His reputation grew not just within academic circles, but among general readers hungry for intellectual honesty in a world increasingly full of comfortable lies. Neil had carved out a unique space in contemporary philosophy, dark enough to acknowledge genuine suffering, sophisticated enough to transcend simple nihilism. Now, sitting in that hospital room with the weight of an impossible decision pressing down on him, Neil faced the ultimate test of his philosophical principles. The doctors had laid out the odds with mathematical precision: a 60% chance of death without surgery, a 10% chance of death with surgery, and a near certainty that successful surgery would fundamentally alter his capacity for the kind of thinking that defined his life's work. His girlfriend Maya couldn't understand his hesitation. To her, The choice was obvious. Life over death, existence over non-existence. But she underestimated the complexity of Neil's relationship with his own mind. "You intellectualize everything," she accused him, tears streaming down her face as they sat on their couch after returning from the hospital. "Now you're considering letting yourself die over the prospect of not being able to intellectualize everything." Her frustration was palpable and understandable. From the outside, it might seem like Neil was choosing abstract ideas over concrete reality, preferring death to a slightly diminished life. But Maya's critique cut deeper because it contained an uncomfortable truth. Had Neil's philosophical pursuits actually improved his life, or had they merely given sophisticated names to his suffering? "You've spent your whole life asking questions and thinking abstractly about everything," Maya continued. "But what has that gotten you? Are you better off than before you started, or if you never had at all?" It was a devastating question, the kind that philosophers spend careers avoiding. Had all his deep thinking actually made him happier, wiser, or more at peace? Or had it simply given him more elegant ways to articulate his dissatisfaction with existence? When his colleague George visited, Neil encountered a different perspective. George embodied the philosophical life in its purest form, committed to truth-seeking regardless of personal cost. His response was swift and uncompromising. "Wouldn't you be dead anyway if you got the surgery and it took from you what makes you who you are?" George's argument struck at the heart of personal identity. If Neil, without his philosophical faculties, wasn't really Neil anymore, then wasn't the surgery just a more elaborate form of suicide? Was it meaningful to preserve biological life if it meant destroying psychological continuity? "You've dedicated your life to understanding the truth of things," George pressed. "How could you give up that ability? It's like trading everything you've worked for, a deep understanding of existence, for ignorance." The conversation with his father revealed yet another dimension to the dilemma. Here was a man who had lived his entire life without engaging in the kind of metaphysical questioning that consumed Neil. And by all appearances, he was content, perhaps even happier than his philosophically tortured son. "I've lived my whole life without asking these sorts of metaphysical questions, and I've been fine," his father observed with characteristic pragmatism. "Ignorance is bliss, as they say." But then, he added something that complicated the picture. "At the same time, there are things in my life that I would sacrifice bliss for, that I wouldn't want to live without. You have to ask yourself what that is for you." This framing shifted the question from abstract philosophical principles to concrete personal values. What was Neil willing to sacrifice for? What aspects of life did he consider non-negotiable? The week following these conversations must have been excruciating. Neil found himself ping-ponging between perspectives, each seeming compelling in its own way. The utilitarian calculation suggested surgery, better a 70% chance of diminished life than a 40% chance of death. The existentialist framework emphasized authentic choice and self-definition. The Stoic tradition counseled acceptance of circumstances beyond one's control. But perhaps most challenging was confronting the possibility that his entire life's work, his commitment to philosophical pessimism and unflinching truth, might have been not just intellectually honest, but emotionally destructive. Had he traded happiness for clarity? Had he chosen sophisticated suffering over simple contentment? The decision Neil ultimately made reveals something profound about human nature and the relationship between thinking and being. When he finally sat across from his neurologist the following Monday, his choice represented more than a medical decision. It was a philosophical statement about what makes life worth living. The sponsored content about hair loss that bookends this story isn't just commercial interruption, it's thematic reinforcement. Here's a company built on the premise that we don't have to accept what biology hands us, that we can fight against genetic destiny and circumstantial limitation. The irony is palpable. While Keep's promises to help men hold on to their hair, Neil was deciding whether to hold on to his mind. Both scenarios involve accepting or rejecting aspects of ourselves that feel fundamental to our identity. Both involve weighing the costs of intervention against the costs of acceptance. Both force us to confront questions about what aspects of ourselves we consider essential versus expendable. Neil's story illuminates a fundamental tension in human existence, the relationship between consciousness and contentment. His philosophical training had given him extraordinary tools for understanding reality, but had that understanding enhanced or diminished his capacity for happiness? His pessimistic worldview was intellectually rigorous, but was it emotionally sustainable? The beautiful cruelty of Neil's situation was that it forced him to apply his philosophical principles to the ultimate test case, his own continued existence. All those years of teaching about pessimism, despair, and hope had prepared him for this moment when he would have to choose between the three. His decision, when it finally came, wasn't just about medical intervention or personal survival. It was about the fundamental question that underlies all philosophy: what makes a life worth living? Is it the capacity to think deeply about existence, or the simple fact of existing? Is it better to be a diminished version of yourself or a perfected version of someone else? The weight of consciousness can be unbearable. Sometimes the very capacity that makes us human, our ability to think abstractly, to contemplate our own existence, to ask questions that have no comfortable answers, becomes a burden too heavy to carry. Neil's story asks whether it's possible to think too much, to know too much, to understand too clearly the fundamental absurdity and suffering that characterizes human existence. Perhaps the most profound aspect of Neil's dilemma is that it had no objectively correct answer. Philosophy, for all its sophisticated reasoning and logical rigor, couldn't solve this problem for him. In the end, he had to make a choice that transcended rational analysis and entered the realm of pure personal preference. The decision he made, yes, he would have the surgery, represents a particular answer to the question of what makes life valuable. But it's an answer that each of us must find for ourselves, hopefully under less dramatic circumstances. Neil's story reminds us that consciousness is both a gift and a burden, that the capacity for deep thought can be simultaneously liberating and imprisoning. It challenges us to consider what we would be willing to sacrifice to preserve our lives, and what we would be willing to sacrifice our lives to preserve. In a world increasingly dominated by surface-level thinking and comfortable illusions, Neil's commitment to philosophical honesty, even when it threatened to destroy him, stands as both an inspiration and a warning. Sometimes the truth is more than we can bear. Sometimes ignorance really is bliss. And sometimes the choice between thinking and being isn't really a choice at all. The question Neil faced is one we all face in smaller ways every day. How much reality can we handle? And at what point does our quest for truth become self-destructive? His story doesn't provide easy answers, but it does something more valuable. It forces us to confront these questions in all their uncomfortable complexity. Whether Neil made the right choice is ultimately unknowable and perhaps irrelevant. What matters is that he faced an impossible situation with the same intellectual honesty that had characterized his entire life. In doing so, he embodied the very philosophical principles he had spent decades exploring and defending. His story serves as a reminder that philosophy isn't just an academic exercise, it's a way of living, a method for confronting the fundamental challenges of human existence. When life forces us to choose between our deepest values and our basic survival, we discover what we're really made of. Neil's choice, whatever it was, represents the ultimate philosophical act, the decision to define ourselves in the face of circumstances beyond our control. In making that choice, he transformed from someone who merely studied philosophy into someone who lived it, completely and courageously to its logical conclusion.